First of all, welcome everybody to tonight's seminar, which is part of the Beeper seminar series, but more specifically of the Human Trafficking Initiative series, which is hosted by Beeper more generally. Tonight, I am particularly glad to welcome Eva, who will give a speech on technology facilitated child abuse. This is a research that fits perfectly in the recent development of the Human Trafficking Initiative project. Eva is part of the team, has already been involved in the activities of the project. She has been a trainer of the Human Trafficking Initiative, which is hosted here at SAIS Europe, but the specific training that she took part in was actually held in Slovakia, more specifically in Košice, where she was one of the trainers that instructed judges, members of the civil service, and NGO staffers and other members of civil society that really benefited from learning more about how to tackle, how to monitor trafficking, and specifically trafficking of children. Eva specifically, and I want to make a little premise that I have been authorized not to butcher her last name. So this is why, not only because I know her from before, but it's also because I don't want to butcher the last name. So I'm going by her first name upon authorization. So Eva is a forensic psychologist, and she's specializing in child sexual abuse and exploitation and trafficking in human beings. She has past experiences with UNODC, and she has been advising numerous NGOs. Currently, her main area of research focuses on a wide study of the lived experiences of victims of online grooming for the purpose of sexual abuse and exploitation. Tonight, to lead and moderate the panel is my colleague and co-coordinator of the Human Trafficking Initiative, Alexandra Malangone. At this point, probably many among you already know Alexandra. Just a few words to remind that she is a criminal lawyer and an expert in human rights, a former member of numerous European bodies that were monitoring human trafficking in the region, but also elsewhere. She has been hosting numerous of these meetings, trainings, and other activities that are pertinent with regard to the Human Trafficking Initiative. Please do take the time to visit the page of the project, which can be found at the bottom of the Beeper website. So if you look where there is the announcements about the openings for TAs, you can also find us. We have numerous activities going on. Number of interns are here in the room. So again, I'm absolutely sure you will enjoy tonight's seminar. I will leave the floor to Alexandra. I will actually leave the table to Alexandra and Eva themselves, so you can focus on them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I don't know what you wanted to say 2 words about Eva, but we let her probably introduce herself at best. So Eva, thank you so much for actually having found the time to be here with us today. And thank you, Sarah, for actually being here also and all your support in the series and in the seminars that we're organizing periodically now already for some years. So tonight's topic is a particular topic. It's great that all of you actually are here. We see people connected also online, and I'd like to start it just by a very, very short paragraph, introductory paragraph from the Italian Anti-Mafia Investigative Directorate report from the last year, which, when it talks about technology and how technology and cyberspace and crime that is in the cyberspace is actually happening, they define it in this way in the most recent report. Cybercrime, writes the Italian Anti-Mafia Investigation Directorate, is nothing more than the natural evolution of crime into new illegal actions. If it is true that each new technology opens the door to the increasingly modern types of criminal actions, It is clear and inevitable that the application of recent technologies and computer and telematics is serving these purposes. Unfortunately, child abuse, exploitation, and trafficking has moved to online space greatly, even more so during the COVID pandemic. In the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, with the immediate outbreak of the war in Ukraine, in huge numbers of Ukrainian children who are basically all the time online, whether they follow the school back home or they are connected because of their friends and families, are extremely vulnerable to these criminal activities. There's also an intercepted conversation in the Tribunal of Milan, which is very interesting for you to hear before we actually dive in deeper and give Eva the floor. This was the office of the judge for the preliminary investigation, and in the order applying a measure of pre-trial detention in prison and measure of house arrest against Aragona Salvatore in 2018, who was one of the members of one of the mafia type of organized criminal groups active in Italy. And what Aragona Salvatore said is this: this is the music of the underworld. This is Malavita music. I look for new followers in the world's best universities, and you still go looking for 4 fools in the middle of the street who are like this, bam, bam. I look for those who go like this, click, click, those who click, these click and move. It's all about the index, you know? So this is the intercepted part of the conversation in that particular order. And it one more time confirms the fact of how cyberspace and how everything that is online is also impacting what's happening in terms of human trafficking, particularly as far as children are concerned, and particularly as far as exploitation for sexual exploitation is concerned. So Eva, it's really, again, pleasure to have you. Tell us a little bit very briefly about you and about your work that you have been most recently doing before diving into the slides.
Thanks for the introduction, Alex. Yeah, so as was mentioned, the unpronounceable surname, my name is Eva Veldhuizen-Ochodnicanova. I'm a forensic psychologist. And as was mentioned, I specialize in human trafficking and specifically trafficking for sexual exploitation, and even more specifically where children are concerned. I've been in the space for good number of years now. And even in that short space of time, I've seen how this crime type has evolved. We deal with a new type of crime, it feels like, every year. So Alex was mentioning the sort of previous work I did a couple of weeks back. I was at the annual Interpol specialist group on crimes against children. And every year we talk about the new and most emerging forms of crime when it comes to child sexual abuse and exploitation. And I can tell you for the last 20 years, it has been surrounding this particular field, technology facilitated child sexual abuse. And every single year we see new forms of exploitation taking place online.
Can I sit in
quickly
here? Because I would have a question. I'm sorry, I step in here with a question. You as a forensic psychologist participate at a closed Interpol specialized group on crimes against children meeting. What is it that you as a civilian have and you bring on the table that the law enforcement does not have?
That's a good question. I think I have an enormous privilege of having more time than law enforcement. Law enforcement, when it comes to these kind of crimes, I'll go into it a little bit later as well, but they are inundated with floods and floods of reports of this type of crime taking place. The advantage that I have is I can bring a bird's eye view. I've worked on the clinical side, so I worked in high security prisons with offenders of child sexual abuse and exploitation. I've worked on the research side in New York as investigating specifically the modus operandi of sex traffickers. I worked at the International Criminal Court at an even higher level, investigating international crimes and how that relates to sexual and gender-based violence. So it's not so much what I have as what I have the privilege of having in my position.
Thank you. Thank you. This also, of course, connects to the fact that you travel the world. Most recently, also apart from being in France and at this particular meeting, a few weeks ago, you designed and trained law enforcement and prosecution in Nepal on forensic interviewing techniques of victims of child sexual abuse and exploitation. Why Nepal? And what is it that you're taking from that training?
Yeah, big question. Nepal is a very particular context. In terms of child sexual abuse and exploitation, it's a country where I don't want to say that it's not recognized, but it's not taken necessarily as a huge issue. The other part of it is that it is because of a situation essentially of underfunding. Law enforcement there doesn't quite have the tools yet to tackle this crime type. And I'm not talking about the most advanced sort of dark web investigations into human trafficking networks and child sexual abuse. I mean, on a real level of what are best practices in terms of interviewing children. What happens if a child comes up to you and says, this has happened to me? What do you do then? So I was privileged enough to go there with the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children on behalf of the US Embassy to Nepal. It was a really, really interesting experience. But yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Eva.
Sure.
Well, yes, absolutely. Go ahead with the slides. I know you've prepared some really interesting slides. Thanks.
Yeah, so before I actually get going into the slides, just a small public service announcement. We are going to be discussing child sexual abuse and specifically perpetrators of child sexual abuse over the course of the next hour and a half. It's a pretty heavy topic. So if at any point you do feel like it is all getting a little bit too much or it's a bit overwhelming, do feel free to step outside for a couple of minutes, take a break. I won't take offense. I won't think that you're not interested in what I have to say. And the same goes for the online audience. If you'd like to switch off your camera briefly, put me on mute, that's absolutely fine as well. Take care of yourself. So on that note, how do I manipulate the slides?
You tell me when I go. Yeah.
I'll
do it for you.
Structure, perfect. So the talk that I have structured for you is essentially based in two parts. In the first, I'll lay out a little bit the scope of the issue. So how common is online child sexual exploitation and abuse? How do we define it? How does it relate to human trafficking? And what forms does the crime type take? Then in the second part, we'll look a little bit more in depth at offenders themselves. More specifically, what do we know about the kind of motives that they have for perpetrating these very severe crimes? Throughout, if you do have any questions, please feel free to put your hand up. I'm more than happy to answer them as we go along. Same goes for you, Alex. Thank you. So on that note, let's talk a little bit about prevalence. Online child sexual abuse and exploitation is not a rare phenomenon. A study from last year from The Economist showcased that around 54% of 18-year-olds reported having experienced some kind of online sexual harm in their childhood. The FBI reports that on a daily basis, around 750,000 adults access the internet, the dark web and the clear web in search of sexual contact with children. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children report that over the course of the year 2022, it analyzed 32 million reports of child sexual abuse imagery, individual reports of child sexual abuse imagery. That's around 87,000 reports a day. And if that isn't worrying enough as a statistic by itself, it actually represents a significant increase, 87% increase since 2019. So it's not particularly surprising that it's online child sexual abuse and exploitation has been labeled a pandemic by the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children, by the US Department of Justice, and by Europol. And as we know from pandemics and epidemics, from our own experiences with COVID, they tend to spread. The other factor is that online offending does not stay online. So there's this misconception of, well, these crimes are not as severe as the contact offending against children. It doesn't stay online. So we thought, when we started researching this topic as forensic psychologists, we wondered, is it that we are dealing with a completely new type of offender? So we had, before the onset of the internet, we had contact child sexual abusers. Has this emergence of the internet, has it contributed to the creation of a new type of offender? Or are we looking at new modes of offending by the same offenders? Unfortunately, we found that it is the latter. So it's almost an evolution of the child sexual offenders that we already knew. So there was a study that was done, for example, back in 2011 of 5,000 convicted online child sexual offenders in Canada. And bearing in mind that these are already convicted, they had absolutely no reason to admit to any further crimes. But when they were interviewed by forensic psychologists, it showed that over half admitted to having contact offenses against children as well. So it's not a different type of offender, it's a different type of offense committed by the same type of offender. There was another really interesting study done last year by Finnish researchers that I cannot pronounce, but it was conducted with 1,500 anonymous offenders on the dark web. So they essentially, to known child sexual abuse forums, they would post the survey link, and these offenders would be able to respond. And it was 1,500 actually did end up responding to this. And it showed that almost half, after having viewed child sexual abuse material, so images, videos, subsequently went and sought contact online with real children. So it doesn't stay online. The other thing that we've seen is that in a lot of dark web child sexual abuse forums, individuals that seek access, so that are trying to get in on the forum, one of the tactics that they use is that the known members request new images from the prospective members. They say, if you would like to be a member of this group, you have to provide your own imagery videos. So in order to A, provide a fresh supply of content, B, to make sure that law enforcement is being kept out, because of course they can't share child sexual abuse imagery, and to make sure that the offenders on those forums have a very good reason to want to keep the identity of the other members secret. So in essence, it's prevalent, it doesn't stay online, but for me, at least, the worst prevalent statistics are the effects that online child sexual abuse and exploitation has on the victims and survivors. So on the slide, you'll just see a couple of them there. There's a psychological side of it. So we see that victims of child sexual abuse and exploitation in the long term have higher risks of depression, suicide, anxiety, internalization and externalization of problems, so a higher likelihood of a criminal record, sexualized behaviors at a very young age, and post-traumatic symptoms, things like PTSD, psychotic disorders, higher chances of schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, eating disorders, substance abuse, suicidal ideation, and that's just the psychological side. That's before we look at the physical element. There's also signs that child sexual abuse victims have long-term health consequences, things like unexplained chronic pain, problems with sleeping, arthritis, diabetes, and reproductive issues. And unfortunately, we know that child sexual abuse is, there's a concept called polyvictimization. So victims that have been already sexually abused have a higher chance of future types of victimization. And the more times victimization happens, the higher the chances that the next victimization will happen. because of these long-term consequences, the US and the EU have actually termed online child sexual abuse a public health issue, which we'll discuss a little bit later as well. But in some prevalent studies show that online child sexual abuse is a serious issue. It affects millions of children, both online and offline, and it has serious consequences as a result.
Evie, may I
Go
step
on.
in before moving to another slide? We said
Mhm.
what happens within online. You said, of course, it doesn't stay online. Apart from seeking contact with real children, how is the material traded? Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, I'll get onto that in a couple of slides'
Great.
time as well. I'll leave it for that actually. So yeah, thanks. So yeah, if you leave it there. You've already heard me talking about a couple of different terms, but just to make sure that we're all on the same page as to what I'm actually talking about, there's a couple of overlapping definitions to be mindful of. So you've got three essentially. You have child sexual abuse, which is the involvement of a child in sexual activity that they cannot consent to, are unable to give consent to, and that they don't fully comprehend. Then there's child sexual exploitation, and that is when there is an exchange of something. So there's sexual activity with a child that is in exchange for something, a gain or benefit, or even the promise of such. So there might be some kind of coercion or threats, but more likely it's due to a power imbalance between the child themselves and the perpetrator. So where those two terms differ, exploitation and abuse, is essentially in that exchange component. So essentially the child is offered a material or an immaterial thing, food, shelter, presence, or things like protection, a relationship. And that's not a necessary criterion for it to constitute child sexual abuse. And then you have the third term, which is child sex trafficking. That is essentially the recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, or receipt of a child for the purpose of sexual exploitation. So where those two terms differ, trafficking as opposed to exploitation, is in the motive of the offender. So the offender aims to profit from or sell the sexual services of the victim. That then becomes, can you click on the next? Thanks. So that then becomes online child sexual exploitation and abuse, any one of those when it's at some stage connected to the internet. So it doesn't necessarily all have to happen online, but if the recruitment of the child is conducted online, or some of the manipulation tactics happen online, or the abuse itself takes place online, those all count as online child sexual abuse and exploitation. It's also really important to point out that in practice, like, theoretically, those three terms are fairly easy to distinguish. In practice, not so much, because there's a significant amount of overlap between the three. So I'll give a couple of examples from my own practice. So there was a boy that I interviewed recently, a Dutch boy. He was 11 years old when he went on Facebook in search of friends. He was approached by a couple of very creepy older men in their 50s, but he was also approached by a lovely young man, 20 years old, very good looking, was very kind. They ended up meeting a few times, and slowly this man introduced the idea of, I have a way for you to make money. And it's a really, really easy way to make money. You'll earn lots of it. You'll get the newest trainers, the newest jackets. You'll look so cool in front of your friends. To make a very long story short, that man subsequently exploited this boy for a period of 10 years in commercial sexual exploitation. So that particular story clearly meets all three definitions. So there was clearly recruitment, transportation, transfer, harboring, receipt of that child for the purpose of sexual exploitation, and the other elements are therefore also met. But then if you compare that case to a Danish girl that I interviewed quite recently, so she was 14 when she went online. She went to Omegle. I don't know if you guys have ever heard of it. I see someone nods. So it's a random matching platform where you can essentially talk to strangers on a webcam. She had the same thing. She was quite lonely. She was bullied at school. So she went online to this website, Omegle, in search of friends. She chatted to a lot of different people, and one man was particularly kind to her. He was very nice. He praised her, he called her pretty, he said that she was very mature for her age, and she had such a lovely time with him that when he asked her, can we please move to a private channel? She said, yeah, of course. Now, bearing in mind that this girl is very lonely, when this guy started asking, please could you undress on camera when we speak to each other, she had a sort of choice to make. Either she does this and she stays in contact with this man who is currently her only friend, or she loses access to the only point of contact that she has. So in the end, she decided to do this. It ended up being a situation of abuse for around 3 years. So you can see how those two cases are very, very different. Very different. It was one offender versus a commercial ring, but it still meets really all three criteria. Yes, there was sexual abuse, but there was also sexual exploitation. In this case, the man traded care for in exchange for sexual acts. And there's also elements of trafficking that are checked. There's the recruitment part. So he enlisted this girl from a website, and then he manipulated her into a situation of sexual exploitation. And there's also a receipt, because he took control over that girl for the purposes of sexual exploitation. So in other words, I argue that really there's not that much difference, and definitely a great deal of overlap between these different crime types. For the purpose of this talk, I will refer to it as online child sexual exploitation and abuse. But please do bear in mind that what I'm actually talking about is an amalgamation of all of these different terms. So, given the quite disturbing figures that I talked about earlier, it would be fair of you to assume that the number of individuals who are interested in sexually abusing children is on the rise. If all of these statistics are increasing year on year, surely that's what's happening. But that's actually not the case. What's changed is how the offenders actually use the internet. So the figure on the slide might be familiar to any of you who've studied criminology. It's called routine activities theory. And the premise of routine activities theory is that a crime can occur when you have a motivated offender, a vulnerable victim, and that those two things meet in time and space in the absence of a capable guardian. So that used to be the case for child sexual abuse. That was contact. A motivated offender would seek out a vulnerable child. They would make sure that they were in a space that was away from their parents. Maybe they also groomed the parents to believe that they're a trustworthy figure, and then would use the opportunity to commit an offense against them. When it comes to online child sexual abuse and exploitation, this doesn't work anymore. There's no need for an offender and a child to meet at the same space at the same time. The absence of a capable guardian still counts. To any of you who are parents, you probably understand that your child uses technology in a way that you do not understand. They have applications on their phone that you've never even heard of, Discord and Twitter, or X as it's now called, Omegle, all of these different platforms. So you wouldn't even know what they are, never mind going onto them and checking who the child is actually speaking to. So the absence of the guardian is still a thing, but they don't need to meet in time and space. So an offender in Canada can, from a completely different space, a completely different time zone, exploit a child in the Philippines via, say, Instagram. So in other words, while the number of offenders hasn't actually increased, we see that the percentage of people who are sexually interested in children tends to stay at between 3 and 5%. But the number of children that they can target has increased exponentially. So whereas before it would be one, say, school teacher who took months to convince a child to trust them, to groom them, groom the family, convinced everyone that they're trustworthy, convinced the child not to tell their parents. Now that same offender can take to the internet, can within 10 minutes target 200 different children. And yes, the majority, 180 of them, 190, are not going to respond. But the ones that do mean that there are still 10, 20 times as many children who are vulnerable to being groomed, who are vulnerable to being abused than there were before. And that's in the space of 10 minutes, not months. And on top of that, we still continue to see a lack of regulation on online platforms. So in a lot of jurisdictions, the offenders actually enjoy a huge amount of impunity from prosecution for committing these kinds of crimes.
Let me just comment
Go
very
on.
briefly to the circle of the absence of guardian and how the routine action theory has been taken further, actually by a colleague from the University of Hull who has taken it further and calling it cycles of analysis.
Yeah.
And replacing in this particular context of technology, replacing absence of guardian by the conducive environment that technology is actually creating for those 200 children that you had just mentioned being vulnerable is actually as if we, are talking about not that there is no guardian, but there is this possibility. So the conducive environment is created by different factors.
Yeah.
And he went even further in exploring those factors. So it's a very interesting theory in case you were interested further.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's called Circles of Analysis by Dr. Craig Barlow, in case anyone's interested. So the offenders haven't changed, the victims haven't changed, the guardian hasn't changed, where the crime takes place, that's the bit that's changed. And the other parts that's changed is the types of crimes that are committed. So we see that the types of crimes that online child sexual abusers commit are expanding rapidly and are changing rapidly. But we can sort of sort them into three different categories. So we have, on the one hand, those that use the internet to produce, to distribute, and to access child sexual abuse materials, abbreviated to CSAM sometimes, and to live stream child sexual abuse. There's then the second category is those who use the internet to find children, to solicit children for the purposes of sexual abuse, either online or in person. So that's got lots of subcategories under it, like coercing children to produce self-generated child sexual abuse material, soliciting children for contact sexual offenses, blackmailing and extorting children using this child sexual abuse material, and sexual harassment online. And then we have the final category, which is commercial sexual exploitation of children, which is essentially, for instance, advertising children on escort websites or abusing children on platforms like OnlyFans, for instance.
Here's an interesting question hits in here about the grooming. Yeah, can you maybe spend a word on that?
Grooming tactics?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So interestingly, the grooming tactics haven't changed enormously since with the onset of technology facilitated child sexual abuse. What's changed is again the speed of it. So there are some researchers like to put it in a phase-based model, others do it in a circular, but essentially it's different phases that tend to overlap with one another. So what we see is that the first step is to actually find a vulnerable victim. So which is really easy. If you have ever been on Instagram, for example, just type in cute petite, see what comes up. There'll be a lot of platforms for young girls who you can tell by their photos, young girls and young boys for that matter, who are vulnerable, who potentially have a low self-esteem. Maybe they're posting about how they were bullied yesterday, or you can see in the comments that they're being bullied by other children. So the first step is identifying that particular victim. The second is to isolate them. So to move them from a public platform, a public forum, to a private channel, and even better if it's encrypted in some way. We then see that the offenders are really good at building trust with their victims. So we see, for example, that they highlight that, oh, you're interested in the band Paramore. Oh, me too. We have so many similarities in common. The child says, oh, I'm just really upset with my parents right now. And the offender says, yeah, I used to have so many problems with my parents as well. It's a misconception that they hide their identity from children. Actually, in the majority of cases, they're very honest about their age, their appearance, who they are, because they don't have to hide it. A lot of children actually are quite flattered that an older person is taking interest in them. Then we see that what they do is they will build a relationship, so either a friendly relationship or a romantic relationship. And the next step is to desensitize them to sexual content. One survivor that I spoke to not that long ago, she said that her offenders used to gauge where she was by asking initial questions like, oh, have you ever done anything sexually? Or when did you have your first kiss? And when the child then divulged more details, then the offender knew, okay, this is about the starting position. Now let's take it one step further. So they would make it, they would, for example, send the child nude images of themselves, or they would send them pornography. They would introduce sexual conversations into the chat. This actually, it sounds like this is a process that takes a while. It usually doesn't. We see that the introduction of this sexual conversation happens in the first day, usually in the first couple of hours of establishing contact with that child. So it goes a lot quicker. And then there's coercive tactics. So I talked about that Danish girl earlier, for instance. She was heavily coerced because she knew that if she stopped talking to this man, that would be her only source of pride, of affection that she was having in her everyday life. Her parents didn't provide her with much. Her friends were non-existent. But there's also other types of tactics to coerce this child. So for instance, what a lot of the offenders do is they induce a sense of responsibility. An 11-year-old does not know that they are being groomed and exploited online. They think that they are involving themselves with this person actively. And the offenders are really, really good at pushing that narrative. So they'll say, oh, you really shouldn't be on this app. Aren't you a little bit young for this? To the point where the child feels that they are doing it to themselves. And that has a double impact, because on the one hand, the child feels like they have some kind of control over this. And on the other, they're not going to tell their parents, the police, absolutely not the police, that this is happening to them, because they feel like they're at fault. And one of the kids that I spoke to a couple of months back from Sweden, she said that even when it came to the police investigation, she had a couple of interviews with the police, and still a couple of meetings into this, she was convinced that at some point the police was going to turn around and go, but you're the real offender here. You're the perpetrator. You're not a victim. Bearing in mind that she was heavily sexually abused by over 100 offenders over the course of 8 years. And she still believed that this is something that she did. Sorry, that was a bit of a monologue. Yeah. So having talked a little bit about the victims, the survivors, what this crime type looks like, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the offenders, and specifically who they are. So this is a quick 5-minute search of last week's articles, grabbed at random in a couple of different languages. As you can see, one word sticks out. It's the word pedophile, sick pedophile, utterly depraved pedophile, prolific pedophile. The word's used quite a lot by us in general, and especially by the media, because it is a real trigger word. Maybe, go on.
I just want to ask, so this is,
Sure.
you did this little scraping just
Yeah.
last week, right? So we have Italy, France, Holland, England, Slovakia, then we have another English, maybe US,
I think that's UK.
UK,
yeah.
another one, another one, another one, another one, another
Yeah.
one. Yeah, just from the last week.
That's just last week,
Mhm.
and that's just a couple that I picked. Now, don't want to say that using this term is wrong. What I will say is that it might just be factually incorrect for some of the offenders that we're talking about. Pedophilia is technically a clinical diagnosis, and as with any diagnosis, it requires a couple of components to be met. So according to psychological associations, both in the US and in Europe, you need three things. You need the presence of arousing fantasies about, urges for, or behaviors with prepubescent children. You need to have either acted on those desires or experienced significant distress associated with those thoughts, the desires. And those need to have lasted for at least 6 months. Plus, the offender needs to be at least 16 years of age, and there needs to be at least 5 years difference between the offender and the age of the child in interest. So the way to think about this is comparable to a physical health diagnosis. So say, for example, that you have a really intense stomach ache and you go to the doctor for it. It might, for example, be let's say it could be appendicitis. That's the eventual diagnosis, or it could be stomach cancer. In the same way, sexual offending against a child is a symptom of pedophilia. The two things are very, very related to one another, of course, but one does not guarantee the other. So we have to be a bit careful when we're conflating a symptom of a disorder with the actual disorder. If we want to prevent and treat and rehabilitate these kind of offenders, we have to know what the etiology of the offense is. We have to know why it's happening, why they're committing the offense. Otherwise, to really hammer down on my metaphor, we risk doing something like taking out an appendix when what was really needed was chemotherapy. So in other words, offending does not arise spontaneously. Offending behaviors, whether we're looking at things like stealing a car or when it comes to sexual offending against children, they need to be considered through several lenses. Within forensic psychology, we look before an offense happens, we looked at 4 different factors, essentially. We look at predisposing factors, things like the individual's biology, their upbringing. Then we look at precipitating factors, so things that happen shortly before the offense. Then we look at perpetuating factors, so factors that prevent the abuse from stopping. And we look at protective factors, so things that might prevent the offense from taking place in the first place. And then what we do is we create these models of offending to be able to conceptualize how an offense might take place to begin with. So with that in mind, what I want to do with the last part of this sort of introduction is to introduce you to one of these models. It's called the Integrated Theory of Sexual Offending. It was developed by 2 forensic psychologists called Ward and Beach back in 2006, and it was then redeveloped in 2016. It's been really thoroughly empirically evaluated. It's the one that's used most commonly in my field. It's a bit of a complicated model, so I'll introduce you to a sort of simplified version of it, highlight a couple of key aspects. If you want me to go into more detail, I'm more than happy to do so if it doesn't bore you too much. But I want to introduce at least one example of how this might work. So I told you it was a bit complex. What we have here is essentially all the way on the right, we have the offense itself, the exclamation mark. All of the bits beforehand are the parts that factors that might initiate the offense and stop it from or prevent it from stopping. So the researchers essentially see sexual offending against children as taking place because of a confluence of different risk factors that together contribute to the risk for an individual taking to the internet and offending against children. So on the top left here, we have brain development. So we know, for example, that an individual's genetic predispositions and neurobiological factors can play one role in heightening somebody's propensity towards sexual aggression. Things like having high levels of testosterone, high levels of cortisol, and genetically low impulse control. On the bottom left, you have the ecological niche. So those are all the factors in an individual's childhood, their social environment, things like their family circumstances, the neighborhood that they grew up in, their personal circumstances. And in the middle, so what those two things lead to is neuropsychological functioning. So the biology and the social factors, the ecological factors, they contribute to how we think. So it fuels on the motivation and emotional side what it is that we want, plus our ability to execute actions and plan those in advance, and our perception of the world around us and our memory of what happened to us. And those thought processes work together to fuel a couple of presenting issues. So these clinical symptoms on the right, things like emotional problems, social problems, cognitive distortions, which I'll go into in a second, and deviant sexual arousal, so sexual arousal to children. And most importantly, there's that little yellow bar on the bottom, maintenance and escalation. So it shows that the offense itself contributes to maintaining and escalating the chances of the future offense taking place. So that's the model in sort of broad terms. I want to give you a little bit of a practical example of how this might apply to actual offenders. And on purpose here, I've picked an example which does not start with sexual interest in children. So the pathway that I'm going to describe as to how it leads to offending, we've seen in research studies that around 1 in every 3 offenders who offend against children online use this kind of, or rather go through this kind of pathway. So for this particular example, we have somebody who in their ecological niche, so in their childhood, experienced a lot of neglect. If you look back on your own childhoods, hopefully you were lucky enough to have an adult who was reliable, who fed you when you needed to, who put you to bed on time. When you were hurt, they were there for you. That would be called a secure attachment, and we see that in the majority of people. But in this case, the child was not so lucky. They had a parent who was sometimes there, sometimes not there, and was inconsistent in their caregiving. What we see that what happens with this kind of child is all of us are essentially geared towards survival. And this child knows that the parent is inconsistent. So what they do in order to get the care that they actually need is to exaggerate symptoms of distress when they're little, in order to make sure that the caregiver actually provides it to them. That is a really useful survival strategy for when the child is a child. But as you can imagine, having that kind of process with your first caregiver can have a real substantial impact on the way that you think as an adult. So the template for this kind of child with the insecure attachment, for this anxious relationship with their caregiver, we see that what the child and now an adult really wants is to, in their motivation, to receive care. But their perception, because of what they went through in their childhood, they might be very, very afraid of abandonment constantly, because they were abandoned in their childhood. So they're really, really scared of being abandoned, but at the same time, they really need to be cared for by somebody else. Then, of course, their behavior, these children are constantly looking for and monitoring, adults are monitoring and looking for signs that somebody's about to abandon them, because that's what they expect, because that's what they went through as children. You can understand how a thought process like that is not going to lead to a particularly high self-esteem. It's also going to lead to a lot of loneliness, a lot of rejection in adulthood from other adults, And yeah, just experiences of a lot of loneliness. And that's what we see with child sexual abuse offenders online. They tend to experience quite a lot of difficulties in their interpersonal functioning, difficulties in intimacy, and have significantly lower self-esteem levels than the general population. This individual might also then develop what are called cognitive distortions over time, so the cognitive symptoms. We all have cognitive distortions in some sense. Your thinking about something can become over-exaggerated or minimized, more negative than it really is, or far too optimistic, or it can become entirely disconnected with reality. In this particular individual's case, they could develop a cognitive distortion around what an adult-child relationship is, what that means. So, of course, this is completely unacceptable in our society. And of course, even from a psychological standpoint, it's entirely incorrect. But over time, this adult could come to see children as a substitute for an adult partner. So remember, they still really, really want their emotional needs to be met. They still really want somebody to be there, but their experiences are of rejection and abandonment consistently. So over time, children could become the alternative. So sexual relationships with children are misconceived, misinterpreted as being consensual between two parties. There's also another cognitive distortion that we see really often with this kind of offender, which is called the unhappy world. Remember, this person's somebody who's experienced a lot of rejection, a lot of loneliness. And so over time, the real world can become seen as quite limited and unsatisfying. And children of the internet are a sort of escape from that. Children are a safe alternative to adult rejection. The internet is a place of acceptance where socialization's easier. It's easier to find like-minded people. And what we see in these kind of individuals is that internet sexual offending becomes a way to escape from the reality of the real world. It's less scary. It's more accepting. And we see that the rate at which these individuals offend escalate during times of rejection. So when an adult sexual relationship fails, then they might turn to children because of this, the heightened level of this cognitive distortion. So in sum, what you have in this particular pathway is an individual who has this insecure attachment style, and in an attempt to avoid those kinds of rejections combined with the cognitive distortions, they come to see the world as an unhappy, unfulfilling place. And over time, this individual might come to offend against children online. If you don't want me to go into a couple of examples of other offenders later on, feel free to ask. But for now, just to quickly, I've given you a bit of a convoluted overview of a convoluted field. So if you go to the next slide, thanks. If there's nothing else that you take away from today, please do remember this. So first, online child sexual abuse and exploitation is widespread, and the availability and affordability of technology without coinciding regulation, we're essentially looking at this spreading further. The other thing I'd love for you to remember is that sexual offending against children is partially and at times due to an exclusive sexual interest in children, pedophilia, but not always. As with all offending, online child sexual abuse and exploitation doesn't arise spontaneously. A range of factors contribute to its perpetration. And finally, a better understanding of these kinds of offenders, why they're committing these kinds of crimes, can help us to build better prevention, detection, rehabilitation programs, and hopefully lower this from happening in the future. Thanks.
Great. Now we move to another part. At the same time, very interesting. And that is a discussion.
Yes.
We have a mic there in the room. Also, people who are online, in case they would want to post a question in the questions and answers side.
Mhm.
I will then read the question and pose it to Eva. So you are invited to also pose the question in the chat. Yeah, I see Michelle.
First of all, thank you, Ava, for being here and for the presentation. I had two questions. For one, you discussed how lack of regulation on online platforms may be giving protection perpetrator. A little bit into how that's maybe through a trial things are happening. And also, I know that AI, with the emergence of AI, this is a huge thing for perpetrators. So how does it play out with child sexual abuse online?
Thanks. I'll start off with your first question with in terms of regulation. There's still very little. In Europe, they are actually planning, they have a draft proposal for revision. You might have heard of it, the whole privacy versus protecting children from sexual abuse. It's still in the running. There's a lot of lobbying from the privacy side to essentially continue to have these platforms be unregulated as possible. Interestingly, the most recent research that I did with survivors of child sexual abuse in Europe, at least, the vast majority of them wanted more regulation. So, for example, if you go onto websites like Kik now, they tend to be less regulated. You can type in a couple of keywords there. And for example, under 12 girls, above 18 men. And there will be specific group chats that you can find that have that specific category of individuals in it. Things like I mentioned it earlier, cute and petite, it's not something that's looked at properly. So the conversations between children and offenders aren't being looked at. The content on platforms isn't particularly moderated. So you see that websites like Instagram, for example, they're having a go at moderating content, but it's really, really easy to bypass. So what they'll do, you must have seen it when you're scrolling through Instagram, they'll blur the image or the video and they'll say potentially sensitive content. But all you have to do if you are, say, a 13-year-old girl or 13-year-old boy on the internet is just click, I would like to see this content, and it still pops up. There are some social media sites that are definitely doing better than others. And we see that some websites like Omegle, for example, was recently shut down, but it's still, there is still a lot to be done. But thanks for that question. When it comes to AI and child sexual abuse, we just see that this is essentially a new tool in offenders' arsenals. We see, for example, that AI-generated images of children are being used to sexually extort further children. So, for instance, so they'll enter a chat with a particular offender and they'll say, oh, the offender will say, I have nude images of you. And the child will say, oh, no, you don't. I didn't send you any. And then they'll send those pictures. And the child will say, well, I didn't send those. They're not me. And the offender will say, well, if you don't send me actual pictures of yourself or actual videos of yourself, I'm going to send these to your friends, to your family, to your school. And that works as a tactic. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, they did a study, or they analyzed their data earlier this year, and they showed that the escalation from images like this, from AI generated images, to a situation of sexual extortion, the time is 19 seconds from the average time from, or not the average time, sorry, it is as short as 19 seconds to escalate from initiating contact to sexual extortion. Yeah, I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you. My name is Massimo, and I kind of have two questions. The first one is about, do we see this happening in other countries, or specifically in some countries rather than other countries, or is this something that is just happening throughout countries in general. And then kind of going off of what Michelle said, maybe the flip side of that question is, it seems like big tech, even with companies like, I don't know, Palantir, for example, I know has a big partnership with NCMEC that in order to use facial recognition in order to identify victims. How do we see maybe law enforcement using big tech to the advantage of finding perpetrators? Because to me, it seems like big tech is both in the middle as part of the problem, but also could maybe be part of the solution. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Okay, great
Great
question.
question.
Yeah. The international question is one that I'm particularly interested in at the moment, because it's what we see is that this takes place in any country where there is online connection that is widespread. But the dynamic between the perpetrators and the victims might not be the same in every single country. So the Philippines, for instance, is a really awful example where phone companies made the internet incredibly cheap. Phone plans were very, very easy to come by, even for children and even for impoverished families. And what we saw is the creation of live streaming dens, wherein primarily family members abused their children. And that was being paid for by offenders in Western countries, primarily countries like Canada, the Netherlands, the US, where you have very high levels of average income, because the internet is the internet, it's worldwide, right? So it's very easy for those offenders to contact parents and children themselves in the Philippines and ask for the parent to do, or the child themselves to perform sexual acts in exchange for what is, for the Westerner, for those Dutch people, the Americans, very, very cheap, but could be a lifeline in terms of feeding the rest of the children, for instance, in the Philippines. So we saw that it escalated enormously in the last years. Your other question, so if I understood correctly, you were talking about the big tech using technology to its own advantage, essentially. There are some really, really great partnerships. It is not big enough. So we've seen that the investment in regulation like this, I mean, you all, I'm sure you read the news, you've seen what's been happening with X, for example, with Twitter, where essentially all of its trust and safety staff were fired, or the vast majority of them. And it meant that they could no longer use the tools that they had built to effectively regulate content and make sure that if there was child sexual abuse imagery, that was taken down swiftly. It really depends on the organization. You see, for example, Meta has, Facebook has quite high investments in this kind of thing, and they do partnerships with organizations like the International Center for Missing and Exploited Children, with UNODC. But there is so much more that they could be doing. And there are some really great tech tools that are being developed by companies like Palantir, for instance, but also smaller companies that if there was big tech buy-in, it would be relatively easy to implement. Thanks for the question.
Actually, maybe connecting to that, there has been a very interesting investigation recently done by Bellingcat. You may find it on the Bellingcat's website. It's about global network of non-consensual deep fake pornography, where also known child abuse images played a part. And essentially, it's also, you don't even have to actually send, I would say, such type of a message, because AI may be able to actually create such imaginary. Yeah, so any person who is dressed may be, so to say, undressed by an AI. Very interesting investigation, but essentially what it's saying is there are people, there are platforms, there are companies that are making money off the production of non-consensual deep fake pornography. So we're not only talking about, consensual somebody saying image, we are already at the level of where AI is able to create that. Now imagine all the material that is already out there that you can just like trade. And then you exactly also said this also links to the sex extortion, so to say. But what is really interesting is there's a lot of money created from this business. It's not being done, it's not staying there, as you said, it's being traded. There's a lot of money flowing. Where is it going? How is it linking to other major offenses happening in the cyberspace, such as drug trafficking, such as arms trafficking, even potentially linkages to terrorism, etc., etc. Eva, have you had possibilities lately through your work with Europol and Interpol to explore this element? And what is it that it is taking us a lot of challenges to understand exactly how these flows are happening?
Yeah. So I am a psychologist. I am not a cryptocurrency expert, nor am I an expert in illicit money flows. I can only tell you what I see from the psychological perspective and the research that's being done. But one interesting example that pops into mind is, as I was mentioning earlier, there is a very quick turnaround, a very quick increase in the number of different ways in which children are being exploited. One of the things that we've seen recently with NCMEC for the last 2 years is that there's been an enormous increase in organized forms of sextortion, so sexual extortion of children. And it was over the past year, I think, from the latest NCMEC report, there was a 1,200% increase in the number of cases that they had regarding sexual extortion. And it was a very specific group that was targeted. It was primarily Nigerian organized crime groups who would then target young, financially well-off boys. And they would usually, in this case, pretend to be a younger girl, a very attractive girl. They would send so-called nude images of themselves. They were not of themselves, of course, and ask for images in return. And what's really, really important to mention there, just from the psychological side as well, is that the impact that this can have on those young boys is really severe. So the executive director, when we were at Interpol 2 weeks ago, the executive director of child exploitation at NCMEC was describing a case which she'd been investigating recently, in which a boy, it was exactly this. So it was an organized group targeting a young boy. They had sent the boy had sent pictures. There was threats that came immediately afterwards. Within 4 hours, I believe, that boy had committed suicide because they did not see a way out of that situation. So even though there is this organized element to it, what's important from my perspective, at least, is that it has very, very real world consequences on a large scale.
Thank you, Eva. This is also bringing us a little bit to the question that somebody has posted in the chat. May I read it out for you now? And it's actually a question from our colleague Craig Barlow from the University of Hull. And he's asking, working with a very small sample of 30 male adults convicted of CCAE offenses in one county within England, I found that offenders aged 40 to 60 tended to use a more diverse range of technology, e.g., digital cameras, phones, laptops, PCs, etc., concealed cameras in their offending. Younger offenders, 18 to 30, contacted victims via social media, messaging apps, etc. The younger offenders became aggressive and threatening more quickly after first contact with victims, and the sexual demands were more immediate. Older offenders engaged in more gradual grooming behavior. Are you able to indicate whether these characteristics might be seen more widely and how this might compare with female perpetrators? We didn't mention female perpetrators much in this discussion. Yeah.
Oh, Craig, I'm going to go straight into the female offenders part of that because I think it's a really interesting question. And thanks for the question in the first place. Female offenders have a huge, I don't want to call it an advantage, but an advantage nonetheless, in their ability to groom children. female offenders, we live still in a very patriarchal society. Men are seen more often as aggressors than women are. And in the same way, sexual activity with boys committed by female offenders is not viewed in the same regard as if it was a female victim and a male perpetrator. So male perpetrators, for example, with a female victim, we see that the disclosure rates happen much earlier, and the disclosures are in more detail. But when it comes to female offenders, it's difficult for boys to realize to begin with that what is happening to them is actually sexual abuse. Because if you look at the way that we've been socially initiated or socially brought up, female offenders aren't really seen as that. The boys are seen as having more agency in that particular relationship. They're told things like, well, aren't you lucky to have been sexually initiated by an older woman? Rather than an offender against a child, it's seen as something more consensual. But also we see that the dynamic shifts when it's a male victim and a male offender as well. Because of that particular society, we see that boys are less willing to disclose because they fear that somebody is going to label them as homosexual. So rather than recognizing that what is happening to them is abuse, they are more worried with what society might think of them as a result. I went off on a bit of a tangent there.
Yeah, I'll bring you back to the question, the
Go on.
second part of the question that Craig is asking. Are you able to indicate whether these characteristics, so younger ones more violent, older ones gradual, might be seen more widely, and how this might compare to female perpetrators, maybe also in the age groups? Is there anything you can think of?
It's a bit of it's very, very difficult to answer that with a lot of certainty because the statistics on child sexual abuse offenders are enormously skewed. The ones that we do have data about tend to be the convicted ones to begin with. The vast majority of them are online, and we see that even the cases that end up being prosecuted, it's a very small minority compared to the cases that actually happen. Especially the successful prosecutions are very small. A lot of these offenders, we simply don't know what the general characteristics of them are. So it's also difficult to then compare. I think it's different for traffickers that we know who they are, and more difficult with online offenders who tend to, on the large part, stay anonymous.
Thank you, Eva. We still have a few minutes. Let me see. We still have like 10 minutes. Are there any more questions? Yes, Ali.
Thank you so much for this seminar. I had a question about if you're aware of certain information campaigns or strategies for information campaigns targeted toward children, like online teens, basically, in lieu of more regulations, like from social media companies or these platforms where a lot of this happens. Like, are you aware of campaigns that exist to try and get the word out to kids? And also maybe if there's like a psychological element or strategy in terms of like what is best in having kids take an ad, for instance, seriously or anything like that.
Yes, a good question. There's a lot of really interesting public campaigns out there by organizations like the We Protect Global Alliance. If you want to have a look at them, Protect Children Online, an organization, a Finnish organization. They also do a lot. There's a lot of campaigns at the moment that are looking into preventing peer-on-peer sexual abuse, because what we see is that the age of offenders, or rather, it's difficult to call them offenders because they themselves are children, of course, but children displaying problematic sexual behavior. So there's quite a lot of interesting campaigns out there that are looking at that are looking at recognizing what harmful behaviors are, what the barriers are. NCMEC is actually the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. They had a, I don't know if it's out yet, but I saw the preview of it a couple of weeks back. It was a campaign to show where to report these kind of crimes when they happen. Because that's a huge issue that we see, is that children might recognize themselves that what's happening is abuse, but they might not know what to do with that. They might not know where to turn. So there are really great campaigns out there that are focusing on how do you report, where do you report. So there's, for example, the Internet Watch Foundation, where if there are known child sexual abuse images, the Internet Watch Foundation in all countries can have a look at that. In Hope, which has different hotlines in each country. Each one has a national number, so they do a lot of campaigning about that as well. Child Helpline International as well. They have a national number in each country. In Europe, it tends to be 116 111 that you can call. And they also do interesting campaigns about this. Thanks for the question.
Hi, thank you. My name is Moxie. I have two questions. One is, are there any efforts by schools to sort of make children aware of what's happening? And then also I'm wondering if there are instances where the victim becomes a perpetrator. So I'm not talking like, but like where children are exploited into making their friends or kind of exploiting other kids, especially like as they get older and bringing, I guess, new people into the scheme, I guess. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and I'll answer your second question and I'll answer your first question. And I wouldn't say that those children are perpetrators to begin with, but I understand what the question is. The most recent study that I conducted, the paper will come out the end of April. We saw that in a substantial amount of cases, I think off the top of my head, the statistic is 20% of the victims of child sexual abuse that we interviewed, they had been asked to recruit somebody else. And in some cases it was children. So it would be, for example, could you ask your friend if they could join this? Or I've seen that they also want money, so could you ask them to join? Or it's some of the perpetrators asked, oh, could you send me pictures of your sister? Because you're actually too old for me.
Yeah. Yeah, but this is really very common also in trafficking for any type of exploitation. That you are basically asked to bring in someone new as a way to buy out some benefit, or even as a way to release yourself from a trafficking situation, so to say, or that you kind of get upgraded in the hierarchy. So you have more freedom, more money, but you're still in. And we see this definitely as far as nexus between trafficking and terrorism is included as well, and the technology, the ways of promotion by bringing someone new in is really an old story, so to say, old story repeating itself over and over again. There's one thing that we maybe have not mentioned, and it could be interesting, and it goes again back to your question about the use of technology, and how technology can help us to actually tackle this. You work a lot with ICMEC, and you know that ICMEC, of course, is using the ICACOPS software. So it's Internet Crimes Against Children Child Online Protection System, which is actually a free software that law enforcement may have available. Europol has it available. How can civil society, forensic psychologists, lawyers, even social workers, who have a liaison within the law enforcement and within the prosecution, actually help and feed into the use of the software in practice? Essentially, when you use the software, you're able to see in a given location a list of given IP addresses that are at that very moment viewing known child abuse material. And often you may get that information even from working with the client directly, who tells you, I have had that type of happening, sextorting happening. I mean, a lot of information is available there with the frontline providers of assistance. If there's that partnership with the law enforcement who's been linked, for example, to the software is working and functioning, we can really be opening a lot of Pandora boxes. But the question is, what then? What next?
Yeah. So Moxie, I'll just answer the rest of your question about schools. Schools aren't doing enough. It really depends, as with the answer to Alex's question, it really depends on the country. Some countries are better than others. We see that internet safety education is becoming more common in schools now, but sexual education tends to be quite limited. And some of the things that came out of the research that I recently conducted as well is that what the kids wanted wasn't necessarily to say, okay, well, this is what online grooming is, but more real life examples using real survivors of this, because they are the ones who know best, and they're best placed to provide an educational program that's based in reality, as opposed to what we as practitioners and adults think child sexual abuse is. So one thing that you see, for example, in the Netherlands is that we have one stereotype of what child trafficking looks like, child sex trafficking, which is called the lover boy phenomenon. And it's essentially one story of a young girl, very vulnerable, very low self-esteem, being targeted by a boy who has a lot of money, who's very cool, who has a lot of friends, who then takes her out and what's called love bombs her. So gives her a lot of presents, a lot of money, takes her out, shows her alcohol, drugs. And then slowly recruits her into sex trafficking, and then slowly says things like, well, if you love me, you'll do this for me. That's definitely one type that happens in the Netherlands, but it's not all of them. So it's potentially not as useful. The public awareness campaigns and educational programs that show one specific type of abuse might not be helpful, because for all the other kids who experience different types of trafficking and abuse, it doesn't apply to them, and kids aren't smart enough to go or necessarily smart enough to go, okay, well, this is what happened to her. Those bits, the gifts and things, I'm experiencing that, but my perpetrator isn't so nice to me, so I'm not being trafficked. I'm not being abused. With Alex's question, there is a really brilliant system, you must have heard it, called Veldhuizen, which was a system that was developed in Iceland, and they provide multidisciplinary holistic care to survivors of child sexual abuse. They provide everything in one go. So the investigators, the child protection officers, the psychologists, the social workers, they're all housed in the same place. It's a very child-friendly space. And what it does that's phenomenal for this particular crime type is you can see that there's a lot of crimes that overlap within this, and there's a lot of care that those survivors need. So what you see very often is that a survivor has to tell their story over and over and over again to the social workers and the psychologists and the investigators, potentially multiple types of investigators. These types of systems, they are brilliant at combining everything that civil society has to offer together with law enforcement investigative capabilities, to be able to make sure that a child spends as little time as possible being interviewed, having to rehash all of those traumatic memories about their sexual abuse, and to make sure that essentially we minimize all those terrible long-term impacts that I talked about at the beginning.
Yes, but Barnhouse model, what's interesting is also in terms of how you may fill the gap with with what law enforcement can offer you beyond that trained officer who's obviously trained in forensic interviewing skills, and he's nice or she's nice, etc., etc. But in many countries, space-wise, you may be the nicest guy ever, but there is not a room where you could actually hear this child in child-friendly setting. Not just yes, you may even try to make it nicer, but it's holistic. It's even prep before, it's what happens there, it's what happens after. Yeah, and you're not alone in this model. There is law enforcement and there's child protection, and there is an NGO, and it's this is, I think, what I find extremely positive in this model, which is spreading throughout Europe. Also, for example, in legislations where you would already have this group as specifically vulnerable group, meaning that in the Criminal Procedural Acts, for example, the interview would have to be video recorded, so that it is just then played in trial. You don't have to provide a evidentiary interview again in trial. That recording, I have seen, investigators that would have like the CNN telecamera prepared in the room. Whereas in Barnhuis, you may have just a very small camera that is within the computer. You don't even realize the camera is there. So I think that this is really what's also, in terms of spatial arrangements, filling in a huge gap. And also it's making the work of everybody easier. So I think it's really an example of a perfect synergy.
Yeah.
And a lot of Nordic countries are promoting it, of course, because it was both in Iceland, and Sweden has it all over. And then Council of Baltic Sea States is very strong on promoting this model. It gone into the OSCE ODIHR, National Referral Mechanism, new handbook as a promising practice. KIND is using it. More and more NGOs are actually using it together with the partners from the government and from the law enforcement. So there's also something to consider. I know that also in Italy, maybe not specifically you would give a name of a Barnhuis, but there is a tendency to actually go this model, so to say. Well, I think we have reached our time. It's exactly 8 p.m. Thank you so much for actually having been with us. We were perfectly on time, Swiss clock. If there are any more questions even after this event, Eva's email will be shared, so you may reach out to her or to me. Good luck with your endeavors and your studies, and thanks again for being here. Thank you, Sarah, for hosting this. Thank you.